Well, still with this, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed his nation earlier today.
אנחנו בעיצומה של מערכה על קיומנו.
He warned that Israel is in a battle for its existence and that the country is preparing for a ground operation into Gaza. He did not confirm when the expected incursion is set to happen. This comes as airstrikes continue across borders in the Israel-Hamas war. The destruction has displaced more than half of Gaza's 2 million residents, according to the United Nations, and it says almost 600,000 of those displaced are crowded into UN shelters. This as food, fuel, and water supplies run low. Michael Knights is a fellow at the Washington Institute specializing in the military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and the Persian Gulf states. He joins us now to discuss what we can expect from a ground incursion into Gaza. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu saying they still intend to do a ground invasion of some sort into Gaza. What is the Israel Defense Forces up against once they do that?
Well, they're up against one of the most dense urban environments in the world, with the additional complication of both tall buildings and substantial subterranean cave systems underneath the city, which Gaza has used, which Hamas has used to hide its troops and its equipment.
We've seen urban warfare in the recent past in Mosul and in Raqqa and in Fallujah. Have we ever seen anything? Is there a historic comparison to what we will potentially see once this starts in earnest in Gaza?
Well, I guess the closest would be Stalingrad during the Second World War, which is not very encouraging. But what we do seem to be picking up is that the Israelis are thinking a little harder about how to get at the urban situation in Gaza in a number of smaller bites rather than one mass invasion.
Right, because when you listen to the reaction in the days after October 7th, it left the world with the impression a large-scale invasion of Gaza was coming. What would have been the consequences, the human consequences, if that initial impression is what comes to pass once the attack begins?
Well, if the Israelis had moved in very quickly without a plan, which was the case back in the early days, we would have seen probably very heavy Israeli military casualties as well as very heavy Gazan civilian casualties. What seems to be happening now is looking at a smarter, slower, partial effort to get at some parts of Gaza City and some parts of Hamas, while leaving other parts of the city and the Gaza Strip untouched.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think it's a scaled down battle plan potentially at this point in time?
I think the Israelis have realized that they were going to take extremely serious casualties and might even militarily fail if they tried an overly ambitious operation. And the Americans have cautioned them that they need to pay more attention to the humanitarian aspects of the plan, and indeed what will follow Hamas in terms of governing and securing and reconstructing Gaza after a battle.
You talked about the casualties. I mean, military history is full of examples of irregular forces, militias, non-state forces like Hamas dealing with a regular traditional military and it not necessarily going that well for the regular traditional military. And then there's the tunnel system. Just what are the tactical and strategic implications of Hamas having 15 years to build up its defenses and dig subterranean hideaways and access points?
Well, this was always going to be a difficult military operation because of the density of Gaza, because of its tall buildings, because of its subterranean systems. Then when you add the hostages in, you get an additional level of complication. So nobody has ever tried an urban operation this complex against this well-prepared an enemy. That's why I think the Israelis are now prepared to slow down, take a really good look at Gaza and at the Hamas defense, and then slowly cut away some pieces of that where that can be done without causing too many civilian casualties in the future.
When you say slowly, what kind of time frame will we be talking about here? Because an urban military operation, it never goes fast because of the threat from above in the buildings and below in the tunnels. I mean, what kind of a time frame do you imagine here?
Well, in West Mosul, which is similar size to Gaza City, it took 180 days to clear that area, so half a year. And that was doing it almost as quick as we could with extremely high levels of destruction. Now, let's say the Israelis are not trying to occupy every corner of Gaza City. Nonetheless, you could still see a careful operation taking 6 months or more. And one of the things the Americans seem to be signaling is that if the Israelis pay more attention to humanitarian and reconstruction issues, then the US is willing to support the operation for longer.
How do you square that with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet's stated ambition to eliminate Hamas? I know you mentioned that they might have faced military failure had they gone all in early. Can they accomplish their stated goal with this reduced military plan if that's what they choose to do?
In the very emotional days after October the 7th, the Israeli government definitely overreached when it created the expectation that it would be able to completely destroy Hamas. What it might be able to do, perhaps using a smarter, slower military operation that retains international support, is to prevent Hamas from returning as the governing authority in the Gaza Strip and to replace it with something backed by Gulf states and the international community that might stand a chance of ruling Gaza and reconstructing Gaza in Hamas's place.
That's a big challenge, of course, right? Who would be acceptable to all the players in that and certainly to the Palestinian people themselves. But I want to, you've mentioned the humanitarian concerns that President Biden has been repeatedly emphasizing since he went to Jerusalem. We have seen a lot of images coming out from the bombing campaigns, and you said the historical comparison to a full ground invasion of Gaza would be, the historical comparison will be Stalingrad. There are no cell phones and live streaming in Stalingrad. I mean, what do you think the world should prepare to see once this, whatever form it takes, the Israeli offensive begins in earnest inside Gaza itself?
Well, we know from experience of, for instance, the last Gaza invasion that was in 2014 and was 49 days long. Within the Arab world, anger builds and builds. In the Western audiences, people tend to lose interest and attention after a certain while when the imagery is similar enough. That's just the reality. But in the Arab world, it retains a salience and an urgency, even after a month, 2 months, 3 months. So we can expect anger within the Arab world to continue to grow.
And the risk there, I guess, is that the streets of the Arab world inflame to the point that states and other actors decide to intervene, and while Western audiences may become numb to it, maybe Western governments pull some of their support for what Israel is doing.
Yeah, that's the concern for Israel, and that's why what we may well see is the Israeli strikes slowing down and becoming more selective, and limited ground incursions that have specific objectives, such as destroying certain tunnel systems. Because it's obvious Israel cannot maintain this level of strikes in Gaza without losing Western support after some weeks or months.
So, Michael Knights, just as a final point, what are you watching for next? What should we watch for next in terms of divining what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet will instruct their military to do?
Well, really, Hamas has the next vote. Once the Israelis go in, we will see whether Hamas executes hostages. That's the grim reality. If they want to stop a ground incursion, and if perhaps Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah don't want to go to full war to deter that, then Hamas will be looking at its options for stopping the Israelis from coming in.
Michael Knights, fellow at the Washington Institute, thank you so much for your time today.